Hello Year 10 and welcome to Poetry Shop Session 4. It's Miss Payne again here with your weekly dose of poetry magic. So we're moving on to one of my favourite poems. It's a Victorian poem. We're moving through the literary heritage, so you can see that there is a timeline developing. We've started with the Romantic movement, so we've got the two older Romantics. We have got William Blake and Wordsworth, the later Romantic, Percy Bysshe Shelley with Ozymandias. And now we're moving into this Victorian era, so context is going to be quite important here. I'll get onto that in just a second. Let's have a look at this lovely piece of work. Brace up, buckle up, let's go. Here we go, My Last Duchess. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Frau Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Will it please you to sit, look at her? I said. Frau Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. But to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I. And seemed as they would ask me, if they durst, how such a glance came there. So, not the first are you to turn and ask thus? Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. Perhaps Frau Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the paint half flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Sir, 'twas all one. My favour at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. She thanked men. Good. But thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900-years-old name with anybody's gift. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one, and say, just this or that in you disgusts me. Here you miss, or there exceed the mark. And if she let herself be less than so, nor plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth, and made excuse, even then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled no doubt whenever I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? This grew. I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together. There she stands, as if alive. Will it please you rise? We'll meet the company below. Then, I repeat the Count, your master's known munificence is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed as starting, is my object. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Klaus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. Oh my word, he is not the type of person you'd like to sit and have a cup of tea with, really, is he? There's lots of things to consider in this poem, and we're going to begin with the title. And we need to think about the significance. It's only 3 words, but they're really important. So we're going to start with that possessive pronoun, my. We need to think about how that's an indication of ownership. So it's almost like the sense that the Duchess was very much the possession of the Duke. We also then need to look at the word last. That's quite chilling in many ways, because by being last, it could be that she is the most recent in a long line. Perhaps there have been many more Duchesses who have been chalked up and bumped off at the Duke's own pleasure. So not a very nice guy. Ideas of ownership begin from the title, so there's lots of things that you can talk about in that respect. recap what this poem is about, okay? In a minute, we'll start to get into that in detail. I think I'll start with context perhaps again. And let's have a little think about this. I've mentioned already that this is a Victorian poem, and we need to think about how Victorian society operated. And on a superficial level, we would think that Victorian life was very proper. People were right, children were seen and not heard, but that truly isn't the case. There was a much darker underbelly. We started to see that in Blake's London, for example, but moving on, we're thinking about how Browning is expressing that here. He was really interested in showing us the repression, the repressed self, what people kept in, that was very much evident in the Victorian age, and this true dark side of human behaviour. Remember, we all have that dark side. Browning believed very much that if you tried to hide your true feelings, that those desires would always find an outlet. It was ideas like this that inspired Sigmund Freud later. He was the father of psychoanalysis and thinking about this dark self that we all keep trapped within. Browning believed that people lived double lives and were therefore very hypocritical in their approach. And he's really known for his use of dramatic monologues. And this poem is, of course, an example of that. It's one voice. He tries to capture voices over places and time. This poem is a great example of it. And Browning had this huge love of European culture. And so he brings this legendary figure of the Duke. You can actually find some history in this poem. I'm not going to go into that too much now because remember, you don't write a history essay. Hopefully we'll get some time in later poetry shots where I can talk to you about the level of context that you need to include. It's just a very fine tip of the hat to it. So that thing of gentle context is very important, okay? Just making sure that you know about ideas of hypocrisy, you know that this is perhaps a historical figure, relevant stuff. So what is this poem about? Well, it connects again to context. So we're thinking about the narrator being Duke Alfonso, and he ruled a place in northern Italy. So we've got that little mention of Ferrara right at the beginning. It's in italics, you can very much see that there. And the Duchess of whom he speaks was his first wife, and it was Lucretia de Medici. The Medici family were a very, very massive, very, very famous family in Italy at the time. Now, she had died very young in suspicious circumstances, and there was a belief at the time that she had been poisoned, and the finger was naturally pointed at her husband. But because she was a woman, she was powerless. The man really had the power to dispose of a woman in whatever way he felt or saw fit. Now, what we actually see in this poem is we see Browning really setting this man up to show himself to be very unpleasant. We don't actually need to see exactly what the Duke did to the Duchess, but we get this certain tone, we get this impression of the unpleasant man that he is. And he shows us in this really clever way that commenting on a certain subject can reveal more about the person making the comments than the actual subject itself. He spends a lot of time criticising his late wife, but when we finish reading this poem, we actually end up feeling sorry for the Duchess and disliking the Duke a whole lot more. I'm sure you can all see that. Let's have a quick look at language. You know I love it. Let's go for it. In this text, we have got an abundance of personal pronouns. And what this hints at is the narrator's very high opinion of himself. I, it's the big I am. He's almost what we call a narcissist. So a narcissist is somebody who is all about the self, all about self-power, self-importance. And that's obviously going to link to conflict within the community that you live, within those around you, if all you value is you, okay? We also get this sense of his selfishness. And again, his authority is a demonstration of that. So we've got some beautiful imperative verbs here. Remember, imperative verbs are command words. So we've got those words like gave, command. He uses all of those himself. We also have this negative lexis, which shows how he believes himself to be so important. He looks down his nose at people. We all know others like that, don't we, guys? He says things like, disgust, officious fool. Doesn't really have a good word to say about anybody. You have to also remember that in this poem, there is this sense that a person has come to visit the Duke, an envoy we call them, like a messenger from a different court, with the idea of setting the Duke up for a match for another Duchess. I would be very reluctant to recommend this, but you think about this match. Can you imagine the reaction of this envoy when he's listening to a man who speaks so negatively about others and so disreputably about his late wife? There is a real sense that this Duke values very much things of material worth. So there's lots of love of possessions evident here. And when you think about it, his wife is one of those. I already mentioned the title, My Last Duchess. And towards the end of the dramatic monologue, we see this sense of notice Neptune, a rarity. He's bragging about material things that he owns. He's got a rare statue. Oh, good for you. We can see that he's very much liking ideas of ownership. This isn't a poem that's full of wonderful imagery, I'm sad to say. It takes us a little while in this anthology within this cluster to get to the beautiful imagery. And what I think this displays in this poem is the starkness, the brutality of the language. Really does reflect the Duke's lack of sensitivity, and he's got a lack of capacity for emotional intelligence. He really doesn't see the world outside him. He lives in a Duke bubble. There is nothing that really affects him. Once again, we see a connection between the Duke and Ozymandias because we see the sense of pride. And remember, I said when we were looking at Ozymandias, pride comes before a fall. It's not an attractive quality. There is an arrogance to the Duke, and it comes through really clearly when he is talking about himself and his title, my gift of a 900 years old name. Very superior, very status orientated. We see repetition of the word stoop and his wife beneath him. Those ideas of positioning. So stooping is almost like, bowing. It's that idea of what you have to do when you are oppressed by somebody who's got a higher status than you. This also reflects perhaps contextually when we think back in history. Some may say equality hasn't even been reached today, but there is this sense that a woman's role, certainly back in the 16th century when this poem was set, was not very impressive. And even during the Victorian era, 19th century, the 1800s, women hadn't achieved equality. We didn't have the right to vote, of course. We've also got what we call euphemism in this poem. Now, for those of you that don't know what a euphemism is, it's where you've got something a little bit grotty, but you use flowery language to conceal it. So if I say, oh, I'm just popping off to powder my nose, you all know exactly where I'm going. I'm going into the loo, and you don't really want to know that. So a euphemism is where you try to make something ugly look a bit prettier. And in this poem, he uses all smiles stop together. We know that means she is dead, okay? Right, now there's a lot of sinister lexis or language or words that comes through in different points in the poem. And this again shows us that he's a little bit of a sociopath. There is something very negative and worrying about this dude. And here we've got looking as if she were alive. We see this a couple of times. Very, very scary, okay? So we've got this image of her. Her presence is almost like this haunting. She is still very much there. And again, linking to context, we can think about how he conceals her behind a curtain. This is still showing that in death, he still has control over her. He now controls who sees her. His jealousy for her niceness. She would be polite to everybody who brought her even small gifts. He couldn't cope with that, but in being able to conceal her, he still controls her. Very disturbing. There is a horrible metaphor within this poem, the flush that dies along her throat. Well, of course, what does that suggest? There is this sense perhaps that it wasn't poisoning, it could have been that her throat was cut. Really disgusting, okay? I'm going to move on to structure and form. I'm going to talk about those things together really quickly. And I've mentioned already that this is a dramatic monologue. As you lot know, certainly from those of you that are drama students, a monologue is one person speaking alone. However, there is an implied audience here. There is the envoy there, and there is almost a sense that there is this conversation that is going on, but we never actually hear the voice of the envoy. Important for a number of reasons, really. But the most important reason is that the dramatic monologue is used to show how much the Duke values his own voice. There is no room for anyone else's opinion. The envoy is seen as inferior to him. He is the superior voice, and only his matters. So this hint that somebody else is there is again quite chilling. It's this idea that everyone else is silenced when they're in the presence of this man. The poem, as I'm sure you've already picked up from the way that I was reading it, is written in iambic pentameter. And we've also got these rhyming couplets. And because the control is quite tight, it's again a parallel, a reflection of the Duke's power. So do remember, power and conflict are really easy to talk about structurally when you've got this very, very tight meter and this very tight structure. The poem itself, when you look at it, it's divided into one long speech, and it's divided up into these rhyming couplets, but to mimic what I would call unrehearsed speech, because it's, oh, excuse my dog, she's going a bit crazy. Thank you, Rosie. I'm sure the students will love hearing you. We can think about how there's lots of twists and turns within the lines. So we can see lots of caesura, we can see natural punctuation and pausing where you would in a normal conversation. So although it is a very rigid structure, it is broken a little bit by that use of punctuation. So we've got the colons, the dashes, and they really do invite pause for thought, and they often happen at the most dramatic moments too. I'm just going to mention a couple of things to you. I don't want to dwell too much on this. You will find that when you look in your anthology, you will have a mountain of information. Because it's such a long poem, you will have so much stuff that you won't really know where to start. Also, when I'm doing these sessions, you will think to yourself, well, my teacher has told me far more than this. This is just a little glimmer of what we know. And that's precisely the point of these sessions. What I want to give you is just enough information to just get things coursing through your veins again, to get you really thinking about the poems and just consolidating your understanding once more. Do remember that on the day of your GCSE exam, you will never have the time to be able to talk about the myriad of comments that you've put into your books anyway. So the things that I say to you, get yourself a nice little blend of those with the top points that you think are relevant from what your brilliant teachers have taught you in class, and perhaps start to streamline those notes. Get yourself some really good revision resources going even now in year 10. Now is the perfect opportunity to be doing them in these unprecedented times. All right, my lovelies. Well, it's been great to talk to you. Hope you enjoyed hearing Rosie, my little dog's voice, as well as mine this week. And you take care, look after yourselves, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye.